I would call this a pilot by the United States, a pilot project.
It's a positive messages we can hear from the US side.
It's a gesture from the Americans. It's an attempt to keep the American AI bubble afloat for a little bit longer.
They have to balance profits with security, and that's a big issue.
Domestic R&D will continue to accelerate. It certainly won't be slowed down by the availability of these chips.
A new way of working together is inevitable.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Washington has just reversed course again. It is now allowing Nvidia to sell its advanced H200 AI chips to China, with a hefty 25% revenue cut flowing straight to the U.S. government. Hello and welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tu Yun. Joining me on this session, Dr. Zhou Mi, the Deputy Director of the Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, Professor Andy Mok from Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Dr. Warwick Powell, an adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology. Welcome back to the chat, gentlemen. So why did the Trump administration choose this moment to approve H200 exports to China? Were you surprised? Shall we start from a third country's perspective, Professor Powell?
You've put me on the spot again. I always wish I could follow up with everyone else first so that my life's a bit easier. Look, I think that the announcement by President Trump in relation to these chips can be understood firstly in the context of discussions that were undertaken a little while back in Malaysia and then culminating in the summit between President Xi and President Trump in Busan, where a range of announcements were made concerning what the Americans would have called wins. And clearly this issue of AI chips was part of the mutual understandings to try to take some of the heat out of the bilateral trade relationships. The second thing is that I think it's a clear indication that the Trump administration wants to distance itself from aspects of the approach that the Biden administration took and imposing an ever stricter regime of controls on the export of AI chips to China by the Biden administration was seen by Trump, and I think actually rightly so, as a flawed policy. It certainly did not advance the ambitions of curtailing China, number one, and in fact catalyzed an acceleration of Chinese domestic chip capability development. And then the third reason is I think that the Trump administration has some domestic political challenges and economic challenges. And whilst the politics of high-tech exports to China is a complicated problem for the Trump administration, it nonetheless needs to find ways of breathing life into the AI sector, which has been central to the American GDP story for the best part of 2025. But around which there are growing doubts that the American AI sector is really nothing more than an ever-expanding bubble. And these announcements, I think, will, at a very minimum, keep that bubble going for just a little bit longer. So is it surprising or not? Well, in the context of these factors, I don't think people should be surprised, but it's a way of understanding what these moves mean.
Right. Andy, what about you? Were you surprised? And actually, before this, I think Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang actually met with President Trump. So how do you think Jensen persuaded President Trump and his advisors?
Well, so I think, first of all, the details perhaps might be a little surprising, but the fact this happened isn't surprising at all. I would call this a pilot by the United States, so a pilot project in something that I call governed interdependence under rivalry. What this means is that it really is an attempt by the United States to see whether two strategic competitors can stay partially connected without surrendering the levers that matter most. And here I'm talking from the U.S. perspective. And this pilot, I think, rests on four truths. So the first one is acceptance. The U.S. recognizes now it cannot seal China off or slow it down. Second, this is a pilot, so this is experimentation. So Washington is not following a particular ideology, a particular doctrine, but really is feeling its way forward in a relationship that is defined by high pressure and high stakes. Third is control. So again, from the US perspective, what they want is whatever is allowed still runs through American gates, whether that's licensing, whether that's rules, whether that's oversight. And then finally, reversibility. So I think the US, again, because this is an experiment, doesn't want to lock in to anything that cannot be unwound. And this approach allows adjustment. So, and I think this strategy is meant to demonstrate humility without weakness and caution without paralysis. And it's a recognition that both rivalry and interdependence have become fused together and are no longer policy choices. About how did Jensen Huang persuade President Trump? I think maybe a couple things, right? So I think, his argument, first of all, from the US perspective, is that if Nvidia does not sell into China, this will create the space for Chinese competitors, and it's better to have Chinese companies on the American tech stack. I think the appeal to let the US government collect, and I believe they're not calling it a tax, they're calling it a fee, whether it's 15% or 25%, is very, very appealing, I think, to President Trump. Again, it's another source of revenue, and he's been very proud of the tens of billions of dollars that tariffs have been bringing into the US Treasury. So I think those are two probably the main reasons. And I think also, this is more of a subtle aspect of this, but he also has given President Trump the ammunition against the China hawks that don't want any Nvidia sales to China by saying, look, we're not giving you the best, we're giving you the second best. And again, this provides, I think, some political cover for Trump. And again, it's a very sophisticated approach that Nvidia and Jensen Huang is taking here.
You're saying that they're calling it fee, not a tax, but essentially it's tax, right? What's the difference?
Sure. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, right? But the US government is making money off of this.
Yeah, that's the key.
Yes.
Dr. Zhou, does this indicate that the earlier plan to push the downgraded H200 chip into the Chinese market has effectively failed?
Well, I would say that it's kind of balance. I don't think that is failed. The target may be not so clear as the beginning when they are trying to forbid the export of this H20 to China, the chips. I think that some of these people may think that is a kind of measurement for US to stop China's ability to follow up, to catch up with US competitors. But others will think that it's as good news, especially from China's side, from the semiconductor, the suppliers and designers. They really want to have a bigger market share. So it means that when you are trying to do more to look at the market opportunity, I don't think that is always the single choice. Like let us assume that in the future, the Chinese companies can buy H200. Well, whether they will still trying to buy some more H20, I don't think that is only one option to choose from these two sides. Based on the different applications and different kind of markets, they are able to use the different abilities of the chips. So I would say maybe our kind of consensus based on these two sides of the government about what we can do to have a better resilience on the relations of the economy. But it's also very good news for the companies themselves. In China, it's really a different market compared with the US. The US mainly are not as big as the size of the market use of the chips. When you're looking at the China's market, it's growing, it's integrating, it is spreading from one area to another. So if they are used here in China, I think that the chips can make better use than before. So I would say that the strategy, I will not argue that as a failed. But I think that it may be a kind of strategy to slow down China's speed to catch up with the US. But clearly, it's not so effective compared with the initial time.
Right. And Professor Powell, actually earlier reports suggested Nvidia might pay only a 15% cut, but now it's 20%. So does this increase signal tighter export conditions or greater confidence in future profits from your perspective?
Well, I think from Nvidia's point of view, it's a small price to pay to regain some market share. Let's not forget that Nvidia's market share in China went from 95% to zero. Getting access to this market again with any product would be seen as a bonus. And Nvidia's CEO made that very, very clear over the last few months that whilst the company's forward forecasts did not include any access to the Chinese market, it would certainly, and well, in fact, it did. It lobbied quite hard and argued the case that restrictions on its capacity to export should be lifted. Let's not forget the China-specific chips that Nvidia did develop ultimately did not meet with much favour from Chinese buyers, and in the end, it proved to the Chinese ecosystem that the Americans were only going to allow what is in effect B-grade product to be sold into China. I mean, it was an insult and ultimately contributed to the acceleration of China's own development. So, no, look, I think Nvidia quite clearly will grab at any opportunity to get a foothold back into the largest market globally. And the fact that it's having to pay 25% to the government is really a small price to pay. The other thing I'll say about all of this is that quite clearly it raises questions around the integrity of American public policy, particularly insofar as the allegations of crony capitalism are concerned. And it is quite clear that those who have the deepest pockets in the United States also have the greatest access to government decision makers and have the greatest ability to encourage, shall we say, changes to government policy in their favour.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Yeah, whether they want to sell it to China is one thing, but whether the Chinese market will, or to what extent the Chinese market will accept it is another. But before we dive into that aspect, let me turn to Professor Mok for, you mentioned H200 is the second best AI chip. Then can you briefly tell us how advanced it is actually compared with those like H20, the watered down chip Nvidia intended to sell to the Chinese market, and compare with the more powerful Blackwell chips, which are still under export ban, and the upcoming Rubin generation? How wide are the gaps, in performance or memory bandwidth and training or inference capabilities there?
Well, Tuyun, without getting into a lot of the technical details, I think what we can say, or what I would say, is that what NVIDIA is doing is they're pursuing a Boeing strategy of strategic appeasement through what I call N-1. So if we think about Rubin as the most advanced frontier chips, Blackwell is the second, or the
currently the
current
best
generation,
right?
Current generation, and then Hopper, which is the H200, is the older generation. That might be the easiest way to think about it. So I remember many, many years ago when I was talking with some senior executives from Boeing, and they said that what they had to do was pursue this strategic appeasement because to enter the Chinese market, they had to transfer technology. But what they did, and they planned this very carefully and strategically, it was always N-1 or N-2, N meaning the most advanced generation. So I think this is what NVIDIA is doing. It's in some sense, we could say this is the essence of good negotiation, right? No one is happy, right? But everyone gets some of what they need. So obviously, I think for NVIDIA, for various reasons, it needs the Chinese market. I think it believes strategically that it can preempt or at least slow down the emergence of true competitors at the frontier of chip performance. But here also, it's important to point out that component level superiority does not necessarily mean you win, because again, these chips go into server racks that go into data centers. And China's made enormous progress, especially I think Huawei, in terms of coming up with clusters of chips that are individually not as good as the most advanced NVIDIA chips, but the system performs about as well. And however, it does use more power. But again, here's the thing that with China has a much lower cost per kilowatt, and the government also provides support to strategic industries. So I think it's not an easy question to answer, but the key point I think it's important to make for our audience is that the US is pursuing one strategy. Nvidia lives inside this strategy, but is pursuing its own logic of strategic appeasement, which I think was pioneered by Boeing. And this is what's going on. And the big question, as you alluded to, how will China react to this? And China, I think we have to think there's two pieces, right? Obviously, there's the Chinese government, and then there are the Chinese tech companies that are the customers of Nvidia. So the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Baidus, et cetera. So I'm sure we'll get to that. But again, I think the key phrase here is strategic appeasement.
Right. Then let's find out how the Chinese market or Beijing would respond to such a strategic appeasement strategy. Let's begin with the official response from the authorities. It seems the foreign affairs officials and commerce officials are not so ardent about making comments on it. All they said was, we've noted the reports. Dr. Zhou, can you tell us your interpretation of such response?
Well, I think that for the government, they really are still waiting for some of this announcement or kind of facts, because you just heard from the news, but there's no physical kind of transactions really happened. In my understanding, maybe without that kind of facts, we cannot just say it's a good thing or a bad thing. But my feeling is that it is a good thing, because both China and the United States, we met in Foshan, and we have some, sending some very good sentiment to the market. So if we're able to open the market, to lift some of the restrictions, I think it's a good news for both sides to have a better atmosphere for coping with the other side. And it's even another question, maybe we haven't touched on that yet, is about the safety or security problems about the so-called H200. So we don't know whether it will be the same in H200. So actually, when the market is trying to do some response, they have to balance profits with security. And that's really our big issue. For the government, we are not just trying to charge for the companies themselves. So I think that may be some of these very sophisticated feelings for this news.
Yes, indeed. You said some security concerns. Actually, Nvidia it's still under investigation into its alleged backdoors, right? So how much might the lingering concerns affect customer confidence, Dr. Zhou?
I think that is a very serious problem, because if the companies can just sell you something, but they can control that from a certain kind of way, and they can just shut down your using of the chips, it will be very dangerous, especially when the chips are used for some important thing, like for the finance areas or other kind of, the on-time activities. I think it's very dangerous, and not just virtually. We cannot just restart everything again. And it will give us a lot of exposure on the possible risks. So according to that kind of risk, I don't think that we'll just leave the so-called the backdoor there. We have to fix this problem. And that is also, what the government need to do, to trying to have more information from the suppliers of the chips, and also to regulate its possibilities of possible dangerous, because it will not just for the companies themselves. Some of these companies are serving the market, and if there's something bad thing happened, and I think that is a widespread of those spillover effects of these disconnections. And if they're just trying to, to change the chip's function, not just stop it, while putting some more bad information or disinformation, I think that is also possible for us to be alert about the possibilities. So I don't think that will be even possible for some of the core businesses in the market in China if the servers are, supported by those chips. So we have to make it very clear and guaranteed to ensure that these things will not happen before we can really accept those chips as the support for some of the very important businesses and activities.
Professor Powell, do you share similar attitude toward this? Can you understand
Yeah, look,
that?
the authorities have made it clear in recent times that there are concerns around security questions, and no doubt those concerns have worked their way through to strategic decision makers across industry who need to be very mindful about these sorts of issues.
Right.
The other dimension to all of this, of course, is that there is a what we could call a geopolitical half-life to these chips, and that is that they ultimately are a technical product that has a limited use-by date. There are no guaranteed upgrades down the track. It's highly likely that there are going to be a whole range of restrictions, particularly in firmware. I can't foresee that enterprises won't be concerned about the absence of ecosystem support down the track. And these sorts of technologies are obsolete in 2 to 3 year cycles at best. So once you take that into account, I think one of the issues you've got for enterprises is how they make use of what you might call a short-term opportunity window. These chips are a better performing chip than available domestic equipment. They're relatively inexpensive, and they can, of course, be, once they're available, you can deploy them immediately for a whole raft of mid-range model training and inference work. So I think smaller firms, particularly startups, are likely to leap at this opportunity, and that will be the obvious marketplace. But your more strategic buyers are unlikely to be developing strategies that would see this technology embedded as part of a mission critical system, right? No one's going to build or design or architect mission critical systems around this particular technology. At best, I think larger operations may see them as stopgaps, but they certainly won't be strategic anchors. Domestic R&D will continue to accelerate. It certainly won't be slowed down by the availability of these chips. And I think ultimately both the government and also strategic technology players will realise, or at least have baked into their thinking, that there are significant operational risks going forward with this particular chip, but also there are unresolved risks around geopolitical weaponization down the track. That's going to make it very difficult for Nvidia to go beyond a relatively modest market share.
This has been the Chat Lounge. When we come back, check out whether this will prompt other governments or companies to reconsider their own restrictions on tech exports to China. Don't go away.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between two vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Yong Wang in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on Washington allowing Nvidia to sell its advanced H200 AI chips to China. To Professor Mok, Jensen Huang actually said recently he was unsure if China would want the older chips. Do you think he's just being, cautious, or what's your interpretation of his words, and what's your expectation here?
Well, I think it really depends, right? But let me just talk a little bit about China's position here, the
Right.
government position first. I think China's facing a difficult problem with this because it has two goals that on the surface appear contradictory. So the first goal is to keep Chinese tech firms strong today. So this would be the Alibabas, the Tencents, to keep them globally competitive, but also to really advance quickly with their AI models. And the logic is really very simple. If you have the best chips, you can build better models. If you can build better models, you can have the biggest economic impact. So if we accept this idea that AI is the new electricity and think about what did the world look like before electricity and after electricity, that it's really crucial that these tech firms are able to really drive productivity, global competitiveness, exports, as well as global influence. So if Chinese firms train on weaker chips, they ship weaker models. And if they ship weaker models, they lose momentum. And there is a certain path dependency here. So if they lose that momentum, it might be very hard to regain. So for this goal, the government would welcome NVIDIA chips. Now, the second goal, though, is to reduce long-term vulnerability by closing the chip gap. And obviously, depending on a rival, an adversary for frontier compute creates a very, very real coercion risk, as we've seen the US with its track record of weaponizing the global financial system, chips, other key technologies. So control over chips is really a control over the ceiling of model power, and therefore over the ceiling of both economic potential as well as national security. So because of this, Beijing, of course, is pushing domestic GPUs, NPUs, whatever you want to call them, right? Advanced manufacturing and the long industrial arc needed to stand independently. So these two goals then again appear to pull in opposite directions. And one cannot satisfy both of these goals at the same time. So I think that really what's going to happen is not choosing one or the other, but balance. And the balance can really be said in this way. China must progress enough today to reach the future and be independent enough tomorrow to be fully sovereign in it. So I think, again, this is, we have to watch how the specifics play out in what the government decides to do. And if we look at the firm level, we have to understand that what NVIDIA sells is not just a chip. And if you're an old person like me, the best way to describe it is in the old PC days, right? It was called Wintel. It was an Intel chip using the Windows operating system and all of the apps that ran on Windows. So if you didn't have that, it's really hard to be productive. And I think most of the key players in China, again, the ones that are going to win the future, have really built on the NVIDIA stack, right? So NVIDIA chips, CUDA, all the software libraries, all of these things. And again, think about how hard it is. Once you learn to use Windows, you go back to DOS, right? And you remember, all the command lines, and you have to go learn something completely new. That's really, really difficult. And I think in terms of just efficiency and speed, I think it's clear. I think all of the Chinese tech companies, if they had, there were no political considerations, would go with NVIDIA. And this is the opportunity as well, I think, for companies like More Threads, right, which just IPO'd, is taking an approach of making it easy to transition by, saying you can still use CUDA, you can still use all these other things you had in NVIDIA, but all you have to do is swap out the chip. So I think we have to see, but I think this is a challenging situation, again, because there's these two very, very important goals that have to be balanced. And then again, from NVIDIA's perspective, obviously publicly listed company, they need a growth story. They want to increase profits, ideally increase margins. And we have to see, I think whatever they can sell in China, I'm sure they'll be happy to sell, and they'd much prefer to sell the higher margin, higher priced items. And again, this is constrained by politics.
Yes, of course, H200 chips got a lot of advantages, like you mentioned. But will this 25% extra fee or levy from
tax.
NVIDIA, right, affect, buyer interest or affect?
Well, we have to see, right? And again, if we think about it like a tariff, conventional microeconomic theory says that tariffs are paid by the customer. But, it wouldn't be surprising, I think, if NVIDIA said, look, we'll cover a part of it, you pay a part of it to make it more cost competitive. We also know that there are all kinds of games you can play, right? In terms of what you call it, invoicing, how much of it is services, how much is the actual chip, to minimize that, whatever that percentage is, 15% or 25%. So I think this is really going to be more of a tactical decision for Nvidia. And again, they have to balance, I think, again, strategic appeasement on the Chinese side, while keeping the U.S. happy again with this, this idea of governed interdependence under rivalry. So, they have to walk a tightrope.
Mm. Then a little bit on this other impact. Actually, I think Professor Powell mentioned a little bit on this, but during the period of strict U.S. bans, Chinese firms actually accelerated local research and development. Now that restrictions are easing, will this to any extent, slow China's drive for high-end homegrown chips? To Dr. Zhou first, please.
Well, yeah, I would say that is part of the possibilities for some companies who really want to, or they haven't decided what kind of the technology rules they want to follow. So it's easier because if you are going to use the already very good technology, it will be easier for you to skip some of this most hard part of the research. But actually, that is not so easy for you to go deeper and higher. So for many companies, like the experts have mentioned about some of these core companies, the big companies, the giant, the players in the artificial intelligence, they will think about that, the future, about the ecosystems, about the whole businesses and environment. For those companies, they were not just trying to, shift frequently from one side to another. I want to say another factor we have to consider about the possibilities for the companies, especially small companies, to use the chips of the H200. It's about the cost. The price of the H200 is very expensive. Maybe in the previous years, it is very difficult for smaller companies to afford to buy the chips and to put them in the scale large enough to support their artificial intelligence model computation. So actually, it's still very difficult for them. But now I think that since the Nvidia have to pay more for the extra cost, maybe it will end some more cost of using that. So for the companies who are trying to shift from one side to another, it is very difficult for them to adapt to the situation. But Nvidia has already, built a very important ecosystem based on the code-based system to support the use of these chips. So for companies, I think that some of them are very, clear. They were not just trying to shift to the Nvidia although maybe it's possible for them to buy the H200, but for smaller companies, it is still very difficult for them to do that.
Right. Professor Powell, do you think it's kind of like a double-edged sword here? Do you think it's a good thing or bad thing for China?
Look, I wouldn't be too worried about it, to be honest with you.
All right.
And the main reason is that the overarching risk assessment will dominate, and the risk assessment touches on both questions of security and ultimately in terms of the geopolitical half-life. We also, of course, have the intersecting reality that this kind of technology, this kind of hardware, has a use-by life that's actually relatively short as well, which means that insofar as China's own development, its current chip performance is below the top-end available chips from elsewhere, but the pace at which that gap is closing continues to accelerate. And so whatever the A200s may or may not provide, particularly for smaller firms in China, it simply will not alter the strategic calculus. The other point to remember in all of this is that there is often a temptation to become obsessed with one element of the overall ecosystem that is actually necessary to deliver the AI performance outputs that we're looking for. And as much as the Nvidia chips deliver the highest performance levels insofar as pure flops are concerned, when you take into account the overall system architecture, and I mean by that the relative difference in electricity costs, the hardware-software co-design that has been undertaken, for instance, with Huawei's Ascend architecture, enabling fine-tuning and optimization, and that compensates for low flops per watt. We've got algorithmic efficiencies, right? So really at a software level, getting much more bang for buck, even if your semiconductors or chips are inferior. And ultimately, we've got vertically integrated domestic supply chains in China. So when you bring all of that together, what we probably have is an environment where you can say that the Chinese chip is weaker, but it's certainly more abundant, it's cheap, and in the context of a whole of ecosystem perspective, it actually outperforms the American chip when treated by itself and in comparison with US ecosystem. So you can't judge AI competency and performance in the end on a chip by chip basis. You've actually got to look at these things from an ecosystem versus ecosystem basis. And the main thing that's keeping the Americans in the game at the moment is actually the fact that its chips are amongst the best in the world, if not the best in the world, and that compensates for the fact that it has high electricity costs. It actually doesn't optimize hardware, software design, and ultimately it also has a business model, which is in large part a proprietary business model that's heavily geared towards answering to the dictates of Wall Street, that needs to monetize in a very particular way. And in that environment, the Chinese environment is more than competitive. The last thing I'll say on all of this, and this goes to how it actually works across an economy, it's not just about having great chat interfaces. It's actually about how quickly the fundamental technology, which is rapid, high-powered compute with big data, can drive functional and operational efficiencies in real workflows, whether they're in government administration or in supply chains or in production management systems. And it is in these areas where China is already excelling. So, look, it's a gesture from the Americans. It's an attempt to keep the American AI bubble afloat for a little bit longer. It's clearly part of a geopolitical détente coming out of Busan, but at a strategic level, I don't think it matters that much.
Right. And given that there are some intended goals by Washington, either by Washington or by Nvidia itself, then how much or to what extent do you think the shift can achieve its goals? Like how much revenue or strategic leverage might this generate for the U.S. government and for Nvidia? I don't know whether Professor Powell or Professor Mok, you've got any estimation there. Professor Powell?
Look, I don't think it's going to give the United States much leverage.
All right.
Let's not forget that a lot of these chips are also dependent on upstream inputs of rare earths. So insofar as leverage is concerned, I doubt that there is actually that much available. What it signals is actually an attempt to take a little bit of heat out of the relationship that has been in place. That's not a bad thing, but it's not going to fundamentally change the strategic parameters that are now unfolding before us. And from a Chinese perspective, watching what has been happening around the world and, of course, taking on board its own experiences over the course of the last 10 years, it needs to be mindful that the United States continues to have a policy of containing China. That's no more clear than in the recently released National Security Strategy, let's not forget. And as a result of that, these sorts of, let's call them short-term commercial opportunities, will ultimately be filtered through a risk lens. And whilst I don't think that there are going to be massive barriers put into place for firms to purchase these chips, firms that do purchase these chips will largely be doing so on the understanding that you don't want to be designing entire architectures around them, and they are nothing more than a short-term stopgap opportunity.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Right then, Professor Mok, economically, can they meet the goal? Like Professor Powell just mentioned, taking some bubble out of the AI market.
Yeah, Yoon, and I think, this is, some people describe the situation as a Rorschach test, right? So, one person can see a butterfly, someone else can see something else. I guess I would say that this could be win-win-win, because, again, this, to me, I would say this is a pilot. This is something that Washington is trying out. Can two strategic competitors still connect without one party here in the US losing some things that it considers important? And I think it's actually a recognition, again, acceptance that the US recognizes it cannot stop, it cannot slow down China. And, some people interpret the latest national security strategy as exactly evidence of that because it prioritizes, the North America, South America, the Monroe Doctrine with the Trump
Mm.
corollary, and only talks about China in terms of economic competition, not as, the pacing challenge that we've heard in the past. So, I see this is acceptance by the US and not just by the Trump administration, but I think China has demonstrated, on September 3rd with the military parade, with the Liberation Day tariffs completely not working. If we remember, Secretary Bessent said that this will force China to knuckle under because it's always the supplier that is most vulnerable. So I think it's acceptance that the US must find a modus vivendi, a way to live with a powerful, technologically advanced, militarily strong, diplomatically central China, and that this is a pilot or an experiment to see if it can happen. From
Right.
NVIDIA's, it could serve, if it works, as a template for other things that can be more stable, and again, creating a new structure. I think from NVIDIA's perspective, again, the market is enormous. Jensen Huang has said, at least half of the global AI talent is in China.
Mm.
China is becoming an even more attractive place for scientists, right? Because of the infrastructure, because, the growth in market, the enormous talent pool already here. So, from NVIDIA's perspective, clearly immediate sales is very good. Strategically, again, being in China, I think provides long-term value. And, from the Chinese perspective, as I said, the government, I think, has two goals that superficially seem contradictory, but they want the domestic tech companies to continue advancing as quickly as possible with the best models and
Mm.
then diffusing them, as Warwick said, is very important. Diffusing them in industries, in schools, wherever, so that the whole society, the whole country benefits. But at the same time, it also needs to achieve greater sovereignty over a critical input, not just to frontier research, but national security. And again, if this works, I think China could have the best of both worlds. It can get NVIDIA chips. Now, again, maybe not the latest generation, but still, H200s are very powerful chips. Chinese companies, whether they're open source or not, can, again, do their R&D, advance, come up with new apps, et cetera, not just in China, but around the world. So I see this as potentially a new, again, a pilot of a new modus vivendi.
You keep saying it's a pilot, but would there be one day when China can eventually get the most advanced ones like Blackwell and Rubin, or there won't be
Oh,
such a day?
sure, absolutely. Oh, I have no doubt that China, at the national level, for strategic reasons, must be at the technology frontier
Mm.
of semiconductors, GPUs, CPUs, whatever, right? But that doesn't mean that an American company, a German company cannot sell in China also, right? I mean, China's an enormous market. It's a diverse market. And again, I think the Chinese position is, to be open to every country around the world, as long as, that Chinese sovereignty is respected, the laws are followed, that there's room for everyone. But yes, I do. It would be hard to imagine that China does not achieve leadership in this area. And I would say perhaps sooner rather than later.
But no, I mean, on the U.S. side, they would open the store, sell its most advanced chips to China. Maybe, we'll have to wait till the day when China has its domestically produced chips that can
Exactly. Yes, yes.
have the best
And I think, and
features.
that's, yes. And I think, but that is the argument that is made, right? That American businesses, American policymakers will argue that it doesn't make sense to not sell certain things to China because China already can produce them,
Mm.
right? So so yes, so you're absolutely right, Yun, that when China does have the equivalent of a Rubin or a Blackwell, I think then there really is no reason for the U.S. government to prevent the sale of comparable products
Maybe
to
then,
China.
right, then maybe it's too late for them to, to open the door up.
Mm.
All right, then would this become a strategic reset or a temporary truce? From your perspective, should be a strategic reset, right, Professor Mark?
Well, we could call it a reset. But again, I think what is changing here is the old world where the US, was the only superpower and could dictate to the rest of the world. That those days are gone.
Mm.
And now the US has to, again, accommodate a powerful China. And just think about personal relationships, right? When something significantly changes with one person, that of course changes the dynamics of the relationship. So I think we are in this new phase, and it could go well, it could go badly. China's not going away. The US is not going away. So, I think that a new way of working together is inevitable. And, again, my hopeful take on this is that this is a pilot that could work. And if it does work, can be a template for other areas.
Then what signal does this actually send out to other countries rather than the US and China themselves? So could this prompt other governments or companies to reconsider their own tech restriction policies on, exports to China, Professor Powell?
Well, the problem is that America does what America does and imposes alternative rules on others. So the fact is that it has a whole range of secondary restrictions which are still in place and seeks to enforce those by ensuring companies elsewhere in the world comply with American diktats. So even if companies from other countries in the world look at this and think, well, maybe there's an opportunity for me going forward, I think they will be more realistic and realise that in the case of the United States, it is always going to be one rule for me and a different one for thee. And we've seen some recent examples of that, the debacle in relation to a chip maker in the Netherlands, for example, Nexperia. And that won't be the only one. We see this as a persistent feature of American foreign policy and American economic coercion. It doesn't always do it directly, but it certainly does it through its proxies. So that's probably the first thing. Look, I'm clearly not anywhere near as optimistic as my colleague, and perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. But I think that the greatest problem for both the Chinese and the American side on this question is that there is a history now of the weaponization of these technologies. The United States has form in terms of imposing all sorts of restrictions on exports in the name of, one objective or another. And there is high risk that there is a change of administration sometime in the future in the United States that will see whatever decisions made by this administration wound back. The other point to remember is that the political configuration in Washington is complex. No matter how powerful the United States president likes to think he or she one day may be, the reality is that it's a complex political environment where the permanent institutions of state, together with the political dispositions of members of Congress and the Senate, ultimately have a lot of say, especially when you have two-year electoral cycles, which creates a continual circuit of politicking rather than an environment in which long-term stability can be put into place. And right now, I think the Washington consensus, if you will, is largely hawkish. Now, Chinese policymakers will note that, regardless of what messages and signals they get from the Trump administration itself.
Right. Then, Dr. Zhou, what kind of opportunity do you think actually the policy shift by Washington would provide for China when it comes to, negotiation with other parts of the world, like Europe there then?
I think that for China, especially in this kind of message, it's a good one. It's a positive messages we can hear from the US side. So the technology, especially the high technology areas are always kind of a very intensive competition area between China and the United States for even before Donald Trump came into the White House. So actually, the tensions are becoming, one of the priorities for many companies to deal with. But if we are able to see some possibilities, I think that is naturally for us to see it's possible for both sides to come to some other issues, not just between us, but also, for the world, like as you mentioned, between, US, China, and the third party. We can discuss about the possible way of dealing the situation. So I think that we should always be optimistic about the market ability. When the market is going to have a better, desire to cooperate, I don't think the government can even block them. So with some good news, I think that we can hear more from these companies. As I discussed before, we consider about the security problem. But I mean, all the companies has obligations to apply, for the requirement by the local government. So we don't think that it's a problem that they cannot just meet our requirements. We can still do more to improve the collaboration in the different ways from the businesses to the government. I think that is a good news for us to discuss about the cooperation. So as one of the outcome, I have noticed that the president, he delivered some messages that the trade on agricultural products, including the soybeans, has already started. I mean, that is beneficiary for both sides. So the collaboration based on the market abilities, advantages, and the demand should be very, very diversified. And the market is still so large. So the opportunities are widespread. I mean, in my understanding, we can do more to reduce the barriers. If we can move on, I think that is likely that companies and markets will benefit from that. Mm-hmm. So no matter from the negotiation to the cooperation in the market, I think that we are in the a time for trying to strengthen the mechanism arrangement between these two sides. I think that is what the market really wants from this both governments.
All right. And lastly, to Professor Mok, your interpretation of the maybe global spillover effects of this, and what broader changes could this partial easing of export controls bring to the global AI landscape, maybe?
Well, I think it could be enormously positive, because, if we're talking about semiconductors, the semiconductor part of the AI value chain, the other key node is the lithography machines. And ASML, which is a Dutch company, again, has pretty much a monopoly there as well, and has been prohibited from selling its most advanced machines to China. But now, given the new national security strategy, which might even portray Europe as an adversary, and if the U.S. prioritizes again its part of the globe and says we're not going to make Asia a priority, we're not going to make Europe a priority, the logic of the Dutch government preventing ASML from selling to China would also go away as well. So, again, I think, if we are in this new world where the U.S. not only has to find a new way of dealing with a powerful and confident China, but this will also realign, I think, a large part of the geopolitical terrain as well. And, when it comes to AI, again, lithography machines are crucial. So this is something I would say keep an eye on.
All right, and that brings us to the end of our chat for this session. Many thanks to Professor Andy Mok, Beijing Foreign Studies University, Dr. Zhou Mi, Deputy Director, Institute of American and Oceania Study, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Professor Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor, Queensland University of Technology, for your time and insights. You can find us on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyun. Join us for more insights at the Chat Lounge next week. Till then, take care.
Dunhuang, situated along the ancient Silk Road, where fine arts and divine beliefs merged with the natural world. It's where the East and West interacted, and where the world's largest Buddhist art gallery still fascinates and amazes people today. A place where stories of life and death, love and hatred, passion and desire faith and sacrifice have been generated and told for 2,000 years. Buckle up for our new podcast, Why We Love Dunhuang, the one and only podcast that can take you to the fantasy world of Dunhuang and beyond through our audio tour. Listen and subscribe for free on major podcast platforms. Why We Love Dunhuang? You will have your answers.